Good morning, dear friends. In today's session, we continue to take a look at Elizabethan England and also try to position the Elizabethan times in this historical sense. So, we will be taking a look at the period, and as a way of quick recap, let us recall that this was the time period in which Queen Elizabeth I was reigning from 1558 to 1603. We also saw how the Tudor dynasty came into being and how Elizabeth I came into power through the various marriages of Henry VIII and through the process of reformation. Okay, we also noticed that there are various ways in which this age was getting referred to. It was known as the Elizabethan era after the reigning queen. It was also the golden age because of the ways in which the period began to flourish in terms of literature, language, trade, commerce, and almost everything. And this is also the English Renaissance. In the fact, what had been happening in Italy found replication in the British world only from the reign of Queen Elizabeth onwards. So this period is also known as the English Renaissance, or this is also the age of Shakespeare, following the name of the most important literary figure of the period, and this was also the time when the British Empire inaugurated all its colonial journey. So it is also the beginning of the British Empire, and we need to give a general background to this period. General background. In fact, Henry Hudson points out that every bridge was dusty with the pollen of Greece, Rome, and Italy. This is how the general ambience of the British world was during the Elizabethan period. The implication of Renaissance, Reformation, and of the invention of the printing press had begun to take a very positive impact in British life during the period, and we have seen in many numbers of ways how Renaissance and Reformation had begun to impact the social, political, and religious life of Britain in general. And in addition to this, and because of the ways in which very conducive atmosphere was getting forced, we also find that there is a discovery of new worlds during this period. And we find explorers and adventurers getting a lot of excitement through this new voyage that they began to undertake to the worlds unknown. In fact, Christopher Columbus' discovery of America could be termed as a turning point in this new voyage towards newer worlds. And this also leads to an explanation of expansion of trade, the accumulation of wealth, and we find this point of time that not just a geographical expansion is bound to happen, we also find an intellectual revival and intellectual expansion at this point of time, and there is general prosperity and internal peace that we witnessed during the Elizabethan times. And this not just because of the political stability of this period. It is also due to the various additional factors which we would see in a short while. And if you remember, during the Reformation time, there was hostility between the Catholics and the Protestants. We find this considerably diminishing during the Elizabethan times, and we do notice that the Elizabethan court is more secular in nature and compared to all the reigning monarchs of England. See, the first one to begin to practice a kind of religious moderation within Britain, and her attitude in general is considered more tolerant, but she is the first one to begin to practice a kind of religious moderation within Britain, and her attitude in general is considered more tolerant. But that aside, it is important for us to also remember that She, during her reign, also due to her the advice of her council and due to lot of political needs, she is also seen to be persecuting some of the Catholics and maybe not in so very blatant ways as Mary be the first did to the Protestants. But we do find that the Protestants enjoy a lot of good favor during Elizabeth's reign compared to that of the Catholics. Many of the Catholics lose their position. That very difficult to it was then very difficult to hold office if you belong to the Catholic faith. So there is an active encouragement to pursue Protestant faith. But in general, the court promoted a lot of religious motivation and sense of secular spirit. And we also find that England, as against Europe, it has become a safe haven for the Protestant. We find a lot of people belonging to the Protestant faith migrating to London, hoping for a better life and for better safe future. And at this time, we also realize that wealth of clergy had begun to considerably decrease. The clergy loses almost all the position that they held in Britain and church also. The Catholic Church primarily loses most of the land which they had occupied in Britain, and their general economic condition begin to plummet during this time. And overall, we find that there is sense of peace, there is a sense of prosperity, there is more political stability. This also led to a cosmopolitan way of thinking among the people, and we find that they all dare to question thanks to Reformation. There is also sense of self-awareness thanks to the many ideals of Renaissance which was getting flourished during this period. And it is important to notice the kind of transition which was happening. We begin to see that in the earlier period, when during the Middle Ages and even in the early Tudor period, the entire socio-political world of Britain was getting famed within the ideas of Roman Catholicism and of medieval theology. So whether it is church or the ideas of faith, order, truth, God, ideas of sacred, the notion of society, morality, and all these were getting framed within how the church was envisioning all of these ideals to be. And soon after Reformation and through the course of Renaissance, we find there is transition towards a different mode of thinking, that the value system entirely undergoes a change. The socio-political and economic awareness undergoes a change. Even the way in which the common people are getting position, their value systems, etc., all of the undergoes a drastic change during this period, and period incidentally becomes the inaugural period of Elizabethan age also. So we find that there is an increased sense of region. There is primary importance accorded to rationality and to culture as against nature, and also a lot of scientific discoveries and expedition take place during this period. And skepticism, in fact, which was looked down upon in the earlier times in medieval theology to be skeptic or to raise any skeptical point was equivalent to blasphemy. One could even run risk of getting executed. But in the Elizabethan period, we realize skepticism had become something of fashionable trade. In fact, many of the intellectual, many of the educative class, they had to begin to display traits of skepticism for being bit fashionable, intellectually fashionable during that time. It was quite a trendy thing. And we also find a lot of travel happening in the Elizabethan period. We also see that court had funded a lot of sea adventurers in order to discover new worlds, to establish newer kinds of trades, so on and so forth. And we do see that there is a more secular understanding of art, literature, religion, morality, culture, everything in fact. And whatever secularism was getting practiced within the court, within Elizabethan court, it gets translates into the streets as well. There is a way in which people are freer to express, and the kind of freedom in expression we find it getting directly translated into the literature of the times. We later, when we begin to look at the drama of the Elizabethan times, we will see that Elizabethan had dared to question and move away from the classical forms of literature and to practice their own kinds of performances, their own kinds of poetry, so on and so forth. So, this transition was very significant not just in the political and social or religious life of England, but it had begun to frame the ways in which English literature was being understood as well. At this point, let us take a closer look at how the society of Elizabethan times was getting framed. This is useful acronyms and which could be used to understand the various factors which would frame nation's event: politics, economics, religion, society, intellectual influences, and artistic trends. This acronym PERSIA, PERSIA, is useful for us to recollect and remember how various events are getting framed. In fact, we have already taken a look at the politics of Elizabethan period, and we saw how various dynasties were getting changed. And we saw the wars, we saw the important events like Reformation shaping the country politically, and we have seen a little bit of how the economics of a nation was getting framed. We will also see in the some of the latest session how a nationalist economy was getting to emerge during that period. We have seen the various effects of religions and how had that had influenced the dynamical change and also the emergent trend in society. In today's session, we will be primarily looking at how the society of Elizabethan times was getting framed, and in the later session, we will take a look at a detailed look at the literature and art of the time. We will also see that intellectual influences and the artistic trends in greater detail. So, coming back to how the society was getting formed during that time, it is important for us to understand how England was during the Elizabethan times. It was very different times altogether. England was undergoing going period of transition, so it is useful to recollect that this is seen as a golden age, and the lot of peace, internal prosperity, political stability, etc. were the dominant features of the time. We have to notice that this is not an easy life for the Elizabethans during that period. During this transition, politically and religiously, they also had to encounter a lot of other problems, which especially the common people were facing. Life in Elizabethan times were not so promising in terms of life expectancy. In fact, the life expectancy was barely 40 years during that time, and it is said that historians from a lot of records they have unearthed, it is generally assumed that 5% of the children died within a week. 40% were just lucky they made it to their 15th birthday, and one in every 100 women they lost their lives after childbirth. So the general health condition were not so promising, especially among the common people. So there were a lot of challenges to even to keep themselves alive during this period. And the other feature was that of patriarchy. Incidentally, the England was ruled by a monarch who is female. England for the first time had a queen, and Queen Elizabeth I. In spite of that, the patriarchal condition of the society did not change much. This is a very ironical fact that historians do not, because within the court there is a predominant of a female power that we find, but outside the court things remain pretty much the same for women, and this was the implication of this, and the reflection of this was found primarily in two things. In education and also in the laws of inheritance, girls hardly got any kind of education. Formal education was restricted to boys alone, and very few wealthy, lucky boys and men got go to the university for formal education. And the women were mostly required to stay at home, and they were getting trained to become wives or mothers. So this was the kind of education that the women during the time received, and their lives were not very better within the household. Either because the head of the house was always the husband or the father. So the women were generally considered as property of their husbands or of their fathers. So there was no amount of power which was getting transferred from the courtly power to any of these women during the period. Or we see here they continued to live a life which was perhaps slightly better than that of the medieval times, and some of the wealthy girls and young women enjoyed bit of education because they were getting trained in languages such as Latin and French, and also some kind of exposure in the dominant kind of art and literature of this period. And Queen Elizabeth I, she is said to have received a very good education at a young age, and which had reflected in the ways in which she was promoting all of these arts as well. So the other things was that of inheritance, the rule of the rule was quite prevalent in Britain during this time, which meant that all the property and the kind of estate, wealth, any kind of position, all of the that were inherited by the oldest male of the family. The female had no power of inheritance. We find the same rule getting applied even within the court. In fact, if you remember King Henry VIII, at the time of his death, he had three surviving children. First one was Mary first, second was Elizabeth first, and third one was Edward the sixth. But we find that the crown directly goes to the young teenage Edward sixth, overlooking both the older sister, and only after the first Elizabeth first. First Mary first, and later Elizabeth first gets to assume the crown. So the rules was pretty strong during the period that found it is so we even within the court, and we do find it in the common people's life were fairly dominated by these rules, so that marriage, relationships, everything was getting dictated around how the estates and other kinds of properties would get inherited, and who the oldest male was, so on and so forth. And not having a male as inheritance could lead to a lot of catastrophe as far as family is concerned. We do know that England even changed its future, its religion, its political nature, all of the, because Henry VIII was disparately searching for a male heir. So this was the kind of power that this rule had on Elizabethan England. And finally, we also see that there is a lot of migration happening from their rural hinterlands of England. So the city of London, because London was increasingly become the center of the power, the center of commerce, the center of courtly life, center of arts, center of drama, and everything that was happening to the country was getting implicated within the life of the city of the London. And at this point, it is useful to remember that England could be divided into two parts. The south and the east part of England was wealthier than the north and the western part, and because of that, there was a great social divide between the classes in north and the western part. And we also find that many of the good changes, the positive changes of the way socio-political things happening to Britain were slow to arrive to the northern and the western part. It was mostly all kinds of development, all kinds of prosperity, all kinds of finer things happening in the terms of arts and literature, drama, etc. They were happening in the southern and the eastern part of England, and everything was focused primarily in London. We see at this point it is important for us to take a look at how Elizabethan London during the Elizabeth period was getting fashioned. As we have noted, there is mass migration from the rural parts towards the city of London, and this had made London in fact the breeding ground of all kinds of disease. There was poor hygiene which prevailed in London. The sanitation was very poor. In fact, there was river Thames along the city by the city of London, which actually had acted as a natural cleaner. In spite of that, poor sanitation had lot of implication in the life of commoners in London. There was no drainage system in place during the Elizabethan times. It had led to a lot of infestation of rats, disease, etc. City was generally crowded because it was overpopulated due to this mass migration from the other parts of the country. It was filthy, which was quite obvious, and it was breeding ground for all kinds of disease. The most important one being Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague. The plague had affected London even earlier. In fact, of Europe was swept under the plague even in the 14th century. That there was plague which lasted for almost a year, we had noted in the one of the various session, but it had struck again during the Elizabethan times. We first see the attack of plague in 1563, and this was after Queen Elizabeth had assumed her throne, and the impact of plague was such that we find Queen Elizabeth shifting her residence from London to Windsor Castle. During this time, she had even avoided all kinds of visits and visitors from London in 1563. There was a prohibition on imports of goods to prevent the spread of plague. It is said that she even excluded all visitors from London to Windsor Castle in order to keep her court safe from any kind of infection. Because once you are stuck with a plague, death is quite certain, and death toll was also quite enormous. Except that in a week, about 1,000 to 1,800 deaths were getting reported. That is really huge number, and we saw in one of our earlier sessions how the huge wipe out of the population had an impact on the way labor was getting fixed, and in the way in which the social classes are getting regulated as well. So the plague struck again and again in 1593, in 1603, and once after the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1608. So we find that this had drastically changed the ways which Londoners were living, and also the life was not considered as very promising because of the disease, because of the impending death of so on and so forth. But the important and the most positive thing for us to remember is that in spite of all these challenges, England continues to go forward in terms of artistic pursuit, in terms of its commercial pursuit, its political stability, so on and so forth. And that is what makes the golden age particularly important for us. Because this was not an age which we devoid of problems, but this was an age where English people were learning to overcome the problems, and that too quite successfully. Now we will see in the next video challenges in this age, in golden age, in Elizabethan period. Thank you too much.